Such a wonderful psalm. The connections, the way they're held up by the psalmist thousands of years ago. The birds and the trees in a relationship. The things in the water in the relationship. It has been the source of our basis for our series in Epiphany, the wonderful gift of creation. I based the series around the childhood hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful. Big when I was a kid. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful. In love, God made them all. Each little flower that opens, each little bird that sings, God made their glowing colors. God made their tiny wings. Here in Victoria, as David said, it is Snowmageddon, and I know that for many parts of Canada, they hold us in derision. But yesterday, I had many times to go out and replace my nectar for the hummingbirds because it was freezing. And it's a wonderful opportunity to look at them so closely as they stand, or at least hover, waiting for me to get moving with the nectar. It's actually a great source of delight in my life. During Epiphany, then, we've been looking at different parts of our spirituality and creation. We started with the Celtic vision, with all their braids and the saints and St. Patrick himself, giving us that theological grounding of God in and through and visible in creation. Next, we took a sacred pause. At the invitation of the Indigenous Ministries of the United Church of Canada, we reflected on what was going on around us, and we were invited to let it soak in and take the time. Our third week, we had the blessing of the animals, a time when we honored our companion animals that are with us and those that have traveled on. And it's a very wonderful time to, again, stress those relationships we have and the sense of responsibility we have and the tremendous gift we experience in some of the most intimate relationships of our life, and for many people, their most profound experience in this life of unconditional love. Next, we heard from the youth, the voice of those who are of the newest generation, trying to get our attention, to take action. And so we've come to the end of our time in Epiphany. It's a short season this year, as you know, Easter moves around. And today we're looking at the relationship here on the coast between the salmon and the old-growth forest. This is so remarkably our story, the British Columbia story. And so we have time to bring it all home to us. So if we were writing a book, and P stood for pets, or C for Celtic, Y for youth, today we'd have old, O for old growth forest. And when I talk about old, we're talking about trees that are between 250 and 1,000 years old. It's like when you're in the Holy Land and you see some of those olive groves where the trees perhaps even were there when Christ walked this earth. Imagine an old growth tree, 1,000 years old. And the S is for our shimmering salmon in the seas around us. Now, there are two that belong to the same genus as the salmon we know, and those are the trout, the steelhead, and the rainbow. But in the salmon world, we have pink, chum, chinook, sockeye, and coho, and then the two trout. That's the S is for salmon. So these beautiful tall trees, increasingly rare. This is named after the most valuable one, of course, that we know of, the iconic Douglas fir. That's named after David Douglas. He was a botanist who was a world traveler, died quite young in Hawaii, and he was the one that the Douglas fir is named after. And some of them are the oldest living trees here in North America. I wanted to add one more less and it's bad because it isn't the right spelling, but I want to do a crisscross with I guess a C or a K for crisscross, how the different parts of nature all work together and are interdependent. The thing we talked about were ourselves with our animal blessing. But so much of the relationship between the salmon and the old-growth forest is rich and important for us to understand, which is why people on both sides of the conversation, the people fighting for the salmon, the people fighting for the trees, have so much in common. Excuse me. You heard in the psalm how the psalmist held up the relationship between animals and trees, between the animals in the sea and the waters. And so for us, that crisscross is so profoundly true. Perhaps the most common thing you would think of is the bear with the salmon in its mouth. It's a million images, it's in art, it's in sculpture, it's out of jade, it's out of bone, the image of the bear taking the salmon. And we know that sometimes the bear eats the salmon at the edge of the water, but most often we see it traveling into the forest. And that's one of the key issues for us. Because think of all the animals that benefit from that simple transfer. The salmon into the bear's mouth being taken into the forest. So in the first week, when St. Patrick was talking to us through his work, he talked about the partnership of seeing God in everything. How do we see God at work in this relationship? The salmon are the most amazing animals. Fish. They start their lives in freshwater streams, and then they migrate, as we know, to salt water, to our beautiful ocean. And then they can be at sea for 2 to 7 years, out there in the salt water, before coming back into the fresh water to spawn. And what's out there that attracted them to the sea? What has nature provided for them that draws them out there? It is the nutrients that they find out there, the nutrients they couldn't find back home in the freshwater streams. So they get big from the nutrients they find in the sea, in the ocean. And so they eat the krill, the small fish, all those things that they find out there in the ocean. And then they come back home to the fresh water. And many of you will have seen that amazing thing. You will have stood beside a stream and watched them arrive, and maybe even anticipated it, going to visit the stream or the ladder early, thinking, are they here yet? As you feel yourself in that ancient story of the return of the salmon from the salt water to the fresh. And when they come home, they become what one person I read about said is like a conveyor belt of nutrients that arrives with them as they come home to spawn. Many organizations here on Vancouver Island are helping to fight for those salmon and for their breeding grounds, and so that there are healthy populations. They, just as the Psalm said, the salmon need the stream banks to be protected for them. So they need the big trees to provide shade for the edges of the water. They need to have habitat where the insects grow that they can eat. And then when that big old tree falls into the water, it creates little pools and stable spots where the salmon coming home can spawn and die. So how much the salmon does about fertilizing the forest. As their bodies are taken in by the bear doesn't eat them all. They're kind of discerning, the bears. They don't eat the whole salmon, but what they leave then, other animals get. And if you're ever watching, if ever you're lucky enough to visit the Great Bear Forest, or if you're up in Haida Gwaii, you'll see that at the side of the water, other animals come down to get the salmon after they've spawned and died. And it's not just the big ones like the wolves and the bears, it's little guys like marten and other little animals. So the carcass then goes into the forest, bringing its nutrients, just as the psalmist imagined so long ago. They bringing it in, and what are they giving as the gift of nitrogen, which of course the psalmist never would have known about. But all this time, imagine it, and if you've been there, you've seen it, the seagulls, the other birds of the air, other little animals coming to the side, coming up, pushing the otter out of the way. You know those beautiful pictures. And so the salmon, in their giving their life for their spawning, provide the nutrients for the forest. And it's for so many animals. And then for the part that nobody eats, gets washed into the very soil itself, providing energy and replenishment. Exactly the image that we heard from the Celtic spirituality, isn't it? That beautiful image of return and renewal. And so we see how this old growth forest and the salmon have an important, life-dependent relationship on each other. And so the First Nations art often shows that sense, almost in some ways that the Celtic art showed, because of course salmon is very important there too. The interconnections that were interrupted so brutally by industrialization and the industrialized processes that took both the salmon out of the water and the trees off the soil. And so the chain reaction of one affects the other. And now here we are, 1/4 of the way through the century, the 21st century, looking at some very grim and frightening realities, but still with time to act, still with a time to be motivated and step forth and claim a spot for these beautiful relationships between tree and fish. And to do it, not because, I'm not an environmentalist, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a person of faith. I want to restore it to the way that I believe it was created to be. We don't want to have nowhere for the tree. We don't want to have the nests taken from the trees because there are no longer any trees because of clear cut. We want to have birds in the sky. We want to have fish in the sea. It doesn't seem to be complicated, but it does seem to be ancient, and it does, of course, seem to be vulnerable. I want to just talk about the spiritual impact of the old growth forest or the salmon. Many of us have been deeply moved watching the salmon fight so hard to get upstream to spawn. I don't know, you may have seen it here in British Columbia, or I guess in Pacific Northwest of the States, or Alaska, where you see the ladders that people have made to try to help the salmon fight back upstream. And you can't help but be engaged in their death struggle. Similarly, the spiritual impact of standing in front of an old growth tree, 1,000-year-old tree. Imagine yourself there. You can see where maybe it was hit by lightning, or was it a forest fire around it? You wonder how many people would be needed to put their arms around the tree, just to span it. And then you step back and knock your head back and try to see the top of the tree, and you never can. And a deep spiritual reality comes into you of its age. It's called being right-sized by the sacred spirit, as you feel yourself a part of this immense tree's story. You look at the bark, so thick and marked. See, the tree doesn't have any branches, way beyond your reach. And at the very top, you know new life is still happening because the tree is vital and strong. And there's a spiritual impact on us. City dwellers as we are, we take the time that sacred pause we heard about earlier, to actually let the tree's reality impact us, the humility of seeing ourselves compared to it, and the importance of our taking action to protect these giants of the forest. We know certain slogans, we've heard certain phrases, and then they become true, that the rainforest, the green forest are our lungs here. What does that mean for us? There are many conversations happening. I was able to join a Zoom meeting with Broadview United Church this week, and it was a rich hour. The time just sped as people talked about what we could do new, what we could do differently, what we need to continue doing as people of faith in this ecological moment. So we wanted to try today to hold up for ourselves the spiritual impact of these two amazing gifts of God, the salmon and the tree, to see them as part of the resources given to our generation and the generations long before us. And in the Eastern First Nations, they talk about the 7 generations. We're challenged, aren't we, to help make this pure and pristine wilderness we have inherited part of the legacy we leave behind. I started with letters, the crisscross and the C. I'd like to end with 3. A-W-E, awe. The Spirit's gift of awe and wonder as we consider the beauty of creation. The psalmist says it for us. Awe and wonder unto thee, O Lord. Amen.